As reflective practitioners, we need to be concerned about the way we learn as teachers. And therefore, what we need to explore are the frames that we use for learning. We, as teachers, as learners as well, we use frames and perceptions and interpretations of frames and perceptions in order to learn. And what this means for the reflective practitioner is that we're always thinking about learning, but also thinking about the process of learning. So what are frames? Frames are simply particular ways of making sense of our experience, of putting into a frame that we can understand, which relates to the complexity of the work that we do. Frames are essentially constructed from our beliefs and values and assumptions as teachers about education and learning. And we can have a multiple framework to work from as learners. So what is the process of framing? Well, the starting point really is what Dewey called a problematic situation. The way we actually frame something is based in our values and beliefs, but is actually generated from something we experience directly. The elements of the frame help us organize the information that we get in a very coherent and structured fashion. Without frames for learning, the learning becomes very inconsistent and very unstructured, and therefore perhaps less effective. Frames provide direction and transform information, data, learning into coherent, meaningful wholes for ourselves. And frames can fall into two categories. We can talk about rhetorical frames, and we can also talk about action frames. Rhetorical frames very much relate to the values and beliefs that we have, how we actually believe that we operationalize our understandings and our skills in the classroom. And then, of course, the action frames are those frames that we use to put into practice our beliefs and values and assumptions. So frames are a little bit complex to understand, and a good way to begin to unpack what we mean by frames is to think of them in terms of metaphors, or in other words, particular ways to communicate and to understand what we're talking about. And metaphors are a great way for us to interact with ourselves and to interact with others as professionals. So based on metaphors, the actions that we take become much more familiar and much more consistent. And this means sometimes, as reflective practitioners, that we need to go through a process of change. So frames can be double-sided in the sense that we have frames and we have particular interests, and these two things tend to influence one another. It's true to say that frames influence the way we perceive the world, but our experiences actually influence the construction of the frames that we use to make that perception. And this then leads to the understanding that the frames that we use to understand our experience are, in a sense, circular. They are not fixed. They rely on an interaction with the environment. The information that we receive and we understand through the frame actually ultimately influences the frame that we're using for that perception. And therefore, what this means is that the frames that we use for learning, the frames that we use for understanding, are actually tacit rather than explicit. They are something that we know but are actually quite difficult to explain.